We've been told the same story for 50 years. Total football was a beautiful, chaotic free-for-all, a system of pure freedom where players simply swapped shirts and positions at will. It's a romantic story. It's also a lie. Johan Cruyff didn't want chaos. He wanted the exact opposite. And if you want to understand why modern football looks the way it does, you have to stop believing the myth. Johan Cruyff spent decades watching the world misread his life's work. He watched coaches copy the surface and miss the soul. He watched commentators romanticize the freedom and ignore the discipline underneath it. He watched a philosophy get turned into a myth. And the myth, honestly, is more popular than the truth ever was. That gap between what people think Cruyff wanted and what he actually wanted is the most important story in the history of modern football tactics. It is also the reason so many teams have tried to play total football and ended up with something that looked nothing like it. So here is the truth. Total football was not invented by Cruyff. That is the first thing to get straight. Rinus Michels built the system at Ajax in the late 1960s, drawing from the fluid positional ideas of Hungary's legendary magical Magyars of the 1950s. Michels himself had been influenced by that Hungarian side. And he took those ideas and turned them into something systematic, something teachable, something that could be drilled into a squad of players until it became second nature. Cruyff was the player who gave it a face, the genius who made it look effortless, and later the coach who pushed it further than anyone else had dared. But he did not create it from nothing. He inherited a revolution and then deepened it. The distinction matters because it tells you something important about how Cruyff thought. He was not an inventor. He was an architect. He took existing ideas and made them structurally sound. What Michels built and what Cruyff refined was not a system about freedom. It was a system about intelligent structure. According to Wikipedia's entry on Total Football, former Ajax defender Barry Hulshoff described the central obsession of that team in one sentence. Cruyff always talked about where to run and where to stand and when not to move. Read that again. When not to move. That is not chaos. That is the opposite of chaos. The entire philosophy rested on players knowing exactly when to stay still, when to hold their position, when to resist the instinct to chase the ball, and instead trust that the structure would bring the ball to them. Most players spend their careers learning how to move. Cruyff's players had to learn something harder. They had to learn when not to. The popular image of total football is 11 players flowing wherever instinct takes them. The reality is 11 players who understood space so deeply that they could fill it before anyone else even saw it was empty. Position switching was not the point. It was a consequence. Players could swap roles because every single one of them had been trained to understand every single role. The fluidity was earned through discipline, not born from freedom. The beauty was a product of the work, not a substitute for it. When you watch that 1974 Dutch side and feel like you are watching something magical, what you are actually watching is the result of an enormous amount of structured, deliberate, repetitive training. The magic was manufactured. Cruyff himself was obsessed with triangles, not metaphorically, literally. His coaching philosophy at Barcelona was built on the idea that every player, regardless of where they stood on the pitch, had to position themselves to form a triangle with two teammates. The ball carrier always needed two passing options. Always. As the coach's voice analysis of Cruyff's tactical methods explains, his obsession with possession led him to develop a model based on triangles, which he considered the ideal basis for keeping the ball while always offering the ball carrier two passing options. That is geometry, not improvisation. That is a system so precise it could be drawn on a whiteboard and explained to a 10-year-old. Cruyff even said it directly. Concentration is vital if you are going to play positional football, with new triangles forming and the player with the ball always having two possible passes. It is not the man on the ball who decides where the ball goes, but the players without the ball. Think about that. The decision is made before the pass is played. The structure creates the options. The players without the ball are the ones doing the real work. That is the exact opposite of the free-flowing chaos that most people associate with his name. The player in possession is almost the last person making a decision. Everyone else has already made theirs. And here is where the biggest lie lives. People hear total football and they think attack. They think Cruyff wanted his teams to pour forward, to overwhelm opponents with numbers, to sacrifice defensive shape for offensive expression. But Cruyff once said, and this is a direct quote, "I am much more defensive than people think." He meant it. His entire system was built on the idea that the best defense is never losing the ball in the first place. If you control possession, you control the game. If you control the game, you control the result. Defense by domination, not by retreat. The goal was not to score more than the opponent. The goal was to make scoring inevitable by making the opponent irrelevant. When he managed Barcelona between 1988 and 1996, building what became known as the Dream Team, this philosophy took its most complete form. He won 4 consecutive La Liga titles from 1991 to 1994 and the European Cup in 1992. But the way he did it was not what the myth suggests. He used a back three, yes, but his fullbacks pushed so high that the defensive line was often just one central defender and a holding midfielder. That sounds reckless. It was not. It was calculated. The logic was that if his team kept the ball, the back three never needed to defend, and when they did lose it, the compactness of his positional structure meant they could win it back immediately, high up the pitch, before the opposition could even organise a counterattack. The defensive vulnerability was real. The defensive solution was possession itself. Cruyff famously said, "If you don't lose the ball in the build-up, it is very difficult to be counter-attacked." That sentence contains his entire philosophy. It is not about scoring, it is about control. Scoring is what happens when control is total. The goal is not the goal. The goal is the process that makes the goal inevitable. He also developed the role of the false nine at Barcelona, using Michael Laudrup not as a traditional centre forward, but as a player who dropped deep, created space, and pulled defenders out of position. This was not freedom. This was a specific, deliberate tactical instruction designed to create imbalances in the opposition shape. Laudrup's movement was choreographed to open gaps for the midfielders arriving late into the box. Every piece of apparent spontaneity had a structural purpose behind it. The improvisation was planned. The surprise was engineered. Now here is the reframe that changes everything. The reason the myth of total football persists, the reason people still describe it as anarchic freedom, is because of what it looked like from the outside. The 1974 Dutch national team with Cruyff at its peak was the most beautiful side most people had ever seen. They reached the World Cup final playing football that seemed to defy logic, defenders attacking, midfielders defending, a number 14 who seemed to be everywhere at once. It looked like freedom because the players were so good, so deeply educated in the system, that the structure became invisible. The discipline was so complete, it disappeared into the performance. And when something looks effortless, we call it freedom. But effortlessness is not freedom, it is mastery. That is the real achievement, not the chaos. The invisible order beneath the beauty. Pep Guardiola understood this better than almost anyone. He played under Cruyff at Barcelona, sat at the base of that diamond midfield, and absorbed the philosophy from the inside. When Guardiola later built his own teams at Barcelona, Bayern Munich, and Manchester City, he was not copying total football. He was continuing it. The positional play, the triangles, the obsession with space, the idea that possession is defense, all of it traces directly back to what Cruyff taught him. As Coach's Voice explains, it was through Rinus Michels' ideology at Ajax that the principles of positional play first appeared, and Johan Cruyff developed those ideas at Barcelona. Guardiola then transferred them to the top of the modern game. The golden thread runs from Amsterdam in the 1970s to Manchester in the 2020s, and it is made of the same material throughout. Structure, intelligence, triangles. Guardiola has said that he sees himself as the most defensive coach in the world. That sounds absurd until you understand Cruyff. Then it sounds exactly right. Keep the ball, deny the opponent the ball, make the game happen on your terms. That is defence. That is what Cruyff wanted. The attacking football is the byproduct of the defensive control. The goals are the evidence that the system is working, not the purpose of the system itself. The lie about total football is seductive because it is simpler than the truth. Freedom is a better story than discipline. Chaos is more exciting than geometry. But Cruyff never wanted chaos. He wanted intelligence. He wanted players who understood the game so completely that they could make the right decision before the situation even demanded it. He wanted football that looked free because it was so deeply understood that the structure had become instinct. He once said that football basically consists of two things. When you have the ball, you must be able to pass it properly. When the ball is passed to you, you must be able to control it. That is it. No poetry about freedom, no manifesto about expression, just two things done perfectly by 11 players who all know where to stand and, crucially, when not to move. The biggest lie about total football is that it was about everyone doing everything. What Cruyff actually wanted was everyone understanding everything. That is a completely different idea. One produces beautiful disorder, the other produces something rarer and harder and more lasting. It produces a system so intelligent that it looks like art, even though it is built on the most rigorous kind of science. That is what Cruyff really wanted, and 50 years later, the best teams in the world are still trying to get there. If you want to go deeper on the tactical revolutions that shaped the modern game, there is another great story on screen right now that you are going to want to watch next.